Condobolin is a small town in New South Wales, Australia, on the Lachlan River. It currently has a population of 3,486. Not much happens there, but in 1954, it played host to an encounter of the creepy kind. On the front page of a December issue of the Condobolin Lachlander newspaper, there was the story of one Mrs. M. Lewis of Fay Street, regarding the night she interacted with a visitor from the beyond. It was around 10 p.m. on the evening of Friday, December 10, 1954. Mrs. Lewis had gone out to her back step to sit down and have a cigarette. It was a beautiful moonlit night. She lit the cigarette and began looking down at her feet. That is when she noticed a blue-green light had seemingly enveloped her. She initially assumed that somebody had pointed a flashlight in her direction, and she looked up to see what it was. That's when she spotted, not more than 50 feet in front of her, a saucer-like machine shining in an aluminum-like substance and suspended about 15 feet from the ground. I was amazed and frightened, and my first impulse was to run into the house and lock myself in. I turned around with that intention and then changed my mind and turned back. The strange machine was still hovering there, lit within by an eerie light, she told the newspaper. Mrs. Lewis stood gazing at the object, unable to move. She was quivering like a leaf. As she inspected the object, she noticed that somebody, or rather something, was inside the craft looking back at her. I noticed a small figure, no bigger than a child, standing at the center window looking out. It had very broad shoulders and was covered by a sort of headgear. It seemed to be looking steadily at me with great curiosity. Mrs. Lewis noted that she had trouble seeing the features of the face because of the bluish light within the machine. Though she wasn't entirely sure why, Mrs. Lewis decided to wave at the figure. She also pointed towards the ground several times, inviting the creature to come down and land. I don't know what made me do it, she recalled. The figure did not move but continued to look at me. Then it extended its arm and waved in a sideways motion 3 or 4 times. Mrs. Lewis had noticed a soft, purring noise, similar to an engine running. After the figure waved his hand, the light went out and the saucer turned slowly around and flew leisurely towards the golf course, which was situated nearby. The bluish light did not go off, but seemed to be withdrawn into the dome of the machine. I noticed that it had a sleek, tapered tail. The whole thing was strangely beautiful, streamlined and shining like glass. After the object departed, Mrs. Lewis ran into the house, took some headache pills, and went to bed. She did not tell her husband until 2 days later. For fear that nobody would believe her, she declined to tell anyone else for at least a week. After some consideration, she decided that her story was simply too important to stay silent about and contacted the Condobolin Lachlander newspaper. She had absolutely no doubt that what she saw that night was not of this world. There is no doubt in my mind that this was a visit from another planet. I certainly saw it and studied it closely for several minutes before it flew away. My cigarette had burned right down and nearly burnt my fingers during the time I was looking at the machine. Since that night, Mrs. Lewis has gone out to the veranda every night to look for any sign of the object's return. Sadly, the visitor and his sleek machine have failed to materialize. She hopes that when, or if he does show up, she will have somebody with her to see it. I really wanted to share this story that was sent to me. I really want to start sharing more stories that have been sent to me over the years. But this one I found to be really interesting. I've read similar stories involving hitchhikers, but usually they're, like easy to kind of like put in a box, like it's a ghost, a phantom hitchhiker story or something. But this one sort of, it kind of falls outside. It's really hard to put in a box. It's really hard to make sense of what is going on here. So I'll just read the account. The following account is of a strange experience that occurred to my mother at the age of 5 along with her family in the winter of 1957. The incident was the picking up of hitchhikers that may or may not be human. The incident bears some similarities with accounts of phantom hitchhikers, but goes much further to suggest that they were real flesh and bone beings. My mother and her family, which consisted of her parents and older sister, lived between the cities of Reidsville and Greensboro in North Carolina. One day they had an errand in Reidsville, and on their way they saw an older couple walking on the opposite side of the road. A couple of hours later, leaving Reidsville on their way home, they saw the same couple in the same spot heading in the same direction as before, almost as if they'd been walking on a treadmill, having gained no ground at all. They pulled up and asked if they needed a lift, and they said they were trying to get to Greensboro to the bus station. My grandfather agreed to take them there, but first they would have to go home to be there in time to pick up their oldest daughter from the school bus near their house. Once inside the car, it became painfully obvious that they were poorly dressed for the cold, icy weather. The woman was wearing a summer dress and sandals, and the man a shirt and bib overalls and shoes along with a brimmed hat. My mother, being a small child, sat between her parents in the front seat, but turned around facing the couple, staring at the strangers as children do, taking in their appearance. The one thing that stood out in her mind was the man's piercing, beautiful blue eyes. The man reached into his pocket and handed her a red pencil with Coca-Cola written on it. When they reached home, it was decided that they would have lunch with the couple, who said they were the Bradleys, before they would drive them to Greensboro. Considering their clothing, my grandmother decided to give them more appropriate winter clothing and coats and shoes for the woman, who only had sandals. Grandmother also decided to pack them snacks and sandwiches for their trip. With their guests well fed, and with warmer clothing and snacks, everyone piled into the car to take them to Greensboro. Halfway on their trip, the Bradleys insisted they needed to be let off on a bridge on Old U.S. Highway 29. Grandfather protested, saying no, they would likely not get another ride, and being winter would be getting dark soon, and insisted on carrying them all the way. But they said no, they must be let off on the bridge. A sort of back and forth occurred between my grandfather and the Bradleys, with them asking to be let off on the bridge. Unable to change their mind, he obliged and stopped the car. They opened the door and got out and immediately disappeared, leaving the door still open. My grandfather was horrified, jumping out of the car, looking to see if they'd fell down on the ice out of his view, but they were nowhere to be found. He looked all about and called for them, but nothing but silence. The whole area was clear as far as he could see, but still nothing. He got back in the car with his family, severely upset and confused as to what just happened, as was everybody else. Frantically, they drove up and down the road looking for them, wondering if they had somehow got another ride, trying to rationalize the obviously spectacular disappearance of the Bradleys. After a fruitless search, they drove back home confused as to what had occurred. This made a huge impression on my mother, having been remembered distinctly all her life. So the question remains, who were the Bradleys? Were they ghosts? Ghosts don't stay all afternoon with you and eat lunch. Furthermore, when they disappeared, the clothes given to them disappeared as well, even the sandwiches that was packed for them. This suggests that they were solid beings. Also, why did they insist on being let off on the bridge, saying it must be done? Was it some sort of portal or gateway home? The whole thing remains a mystery.